from BFM 89.9, the business station.
Alliance Bank presents you The Breakfast Grill. Top interviews you can't afford to miss on BFM 89.9, the business station.
Good morning, I'm Melissa Idris, and today on The Breakfast Grill, I'm speaking to Camille Blackburn, who was a principal advisor to the Australian Government's Financial System Inquiry in 2014. Camille, welcome to The Breakfast Grill.
Thank you for having me.
So for starters, Camille, could you explain exactly what the inquiry was set up to do?
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. So the Financial System Inquiry report, it's an inquiry that happens about every 15 years in Australia. What it is, it's commissioned by the government to look at the financial system as a whole and the regulation of that financial system. Just really a stock take to assess that it's structured for the future. Right. So it's a point in time look at how the financial system is operating and how it's regulated, what the oversight of the financial system is, just to check that we think that it is it's appropriate for the future.
So you would look at the regulators of banks, of insurance, of superannuation. Is that right? That's right. So it's a look at the financial system as a whole, and that financial system, of course, includes its regulators. So the stability regulators, the Reserve Bank, but also the prudential regulators and the conduct regulators. So in Australia, that's APRA is our prudential regulator, and we have a Securities Commission like you do, our conduct regulator as well. And we look at how they're operating and how they're structured, and just check that we think that structure is comprehensive and complete for looking forward. Does it tend to change? You mentioned that this inquiry is for every 15 years. Does it tend to change a lot after 15 years?
Well, it is. I mean, I've worked in financial regulation for about 20 years, and if you're as interested as I unfortunately am in that sort of thing, these inquiries are probably the most exciting thing that happens in our economy for people that have the level of interest that I do in regulation and financial services. They've got a very good track record. So this was about the fourth of these that happens. Right. They've got a very good track record in making recommendations that are actually carried through by the government. The Australian government yet hasn't responded to the recommendations of the Financial System Inquiry, so we're yet to see what the strike rate is on the report that was delivered to the government last November. Right. But for someone working on that report, it's got a good track record.
So, Camille, why do we need inquiries like these?
Well, I suppose the focus of the symposium I'm attending at the moment is all about fintech, financial technology, and how that's affecting the delivery of financial services in the economy. And that, those sorts of developments are exactly why, you need assessments from time to time about whether the system as it's structured and the regulators and the oversight of that system remains appropriate. So thinking about fintech, there are lots of different ways that financial services will be delivered to consumers going forward. And we need to make sure that the plumbing of the financial services economy, things like our payment systems, are ready to absorb the sorts of changes we're going to see through financial innovation going forward, but also that our laws are structured in a way that are comprehensive and have anticipated, what some of these changes are that we see coming down the track.
So you're actually future-proofing the financial system of Australia?
Thank you. That is a term that was used a lot last year.
Okay.
So we're trying to, but of course that future-looking role of these sorts of inquiries is getting more and more difficult with the pace of change. So even I know that there is only a certain amount of the future that you, at a point in time that you can anticipate, and so we will still need to be nimble and agile going forward.
Especially when it comes to technology. So you're talking about financial technology, fintech. How can you anticipate how technology is going to evolve in the future?
Indeed, how can you?
How can you? Yes, and you're talking about a time frame of 2015 to 2025. That's 10 years, right?
Indeed. So we've got no hope of doing that. No hope whatsoever. I mean, in the sort of game that I operate in, we the languages that the language that we employ is we are looking for the opportunities. So what the opportunities from a consumer's perspective, from a investor's perspective of these sorts of innovations, what are the things that we're trying to make sure that the system can accommodate, to make sure that the services that are being provided to consumers are better. Right. So with fintech, I mean, fintech sounds fancy and exciting.
It's sexy right now.
Yeah, it's so sexy right now. It's so hot right now. But, you know, the way that you can relate to what fintech is about is that you can now do your banking on your telephone. Mm-hmm. And you think about the sorts of advantages that provides you. It means that you, rather than even going to an ATM machine, you can do your banking on the bus on the way to work. Right. You know, so we're talking about convenience, issues of convenience. We're talking about issues of speed of service. Mm-hmm. We're talking about accessibility. There are certain areas or people that haven't really engaged with financial services before that suddenly find it so much more accessible. People living in remote areas can bank over their phone rather than having to go to a terminal. So it is all pretty exciting, and the benefits are very, very obvious. But behind the scenes, it's important that governments and the private sector are making sure that their plumbing that they use to make sure these things can happen and can continue to happen. So that's the sort of changes that we're trying to anticipate if you're in public policy.
Well, if we could just focus a little bit more on fintech, Camille, when do you think the boom in fintech actually happened? Was it in the past year, 2 years, 3 years ago?
I think it's about to happen.
Oh, it's not yet happened?
No, I don't think so. I think we're tasting it, and we're tasting the benefits that it can provide. But in Malaysia, the Securities Commission have recently announced that they are future-proofing your system to accommodate crowdfunding. Mm-hmm. So for the first time, investors, retail investors, will be able to participate in capital raising for new businesses, and that's something that has never been done before. It couldn't be done because of practical issues. You couldn't. There was no internet, so you couldn't find out about all the different available investment opportunities, and the internet has made that far more accessible to everybody. But the legal system also didn't allow that. Didn't allow what we call offers to the public. Mm-hmm. were prohibited unless you were very big and very sophisticated. And now consumers are showing that they're interested in being able to vote on the success of businesses throughout an economy. Mm-hmm. It really is just another form of voting, though regulators, of course, are more anxious about this type of voting because it involves people's savings. Okay. So we need to make sure that there's a responsible and a confident environment in which that can occur.
Can we use the Australia example? How has Australia adapted to areas like crowdfunding, for instance?
Well, no, Malaysia's beaten Australia to the finishing line on that. Okay. Crowdfunding is something that has been around in the US and has been around in the UK for a while. Australia's looking at it at the moment, and there were recommendations as part of the financial system inquiry that it was something that we needed to accommodate because it was a growth area and a new and novel and exciting area in capital raising. Sort of, it is the big fintech innovation for capital raising for businesses globally. It's a mega trend globally. It's how the internet has affected capital raising globally. But our laws haven't yet been accommodated to allow it. So you've beat us to the finishing line on that one.
Why do you think that is, Camille? I mean, why has the pickup in Australia not been as quick?
We won't be far behind, I don't think. I don't know, because the government hasn't
Is crowdfunding a big thing in Australia?
I think it will be a big thing. I think it's an exciting thing. Mm-hmm. the reason why it will be big, I think it will be interesting. I think it will be big both in Malaysia and Australia because we both have big SME environments, right. And small and medium enterprises have traditionally found obtaining finance from banks quite labour intensive in the application process. There's a lot of information that banks
You
expect.
Need a track record and all the layers that come with.
That's right. And typically most banks will also ask for security over personal assets. So as an SME operator, you may be asked to provide security over your personal car or your personal home. So there's a merger of your business assets and your personal assets. And that's why crowdfunding is a little bit exciting because the security element won't be there. You will be asking people for money from the general public, and that will hopefully impose that'll impose a fair bit of discipline over the way you operate your small business when you know that there are investors out there that are interested in how you're going and will need to be actively informed about how you're going with your small business.
Right.
So the factors that have led to crowdfunding emerging, and I suspect making sure that it will stay, it is here to stay, is that there's a fair bit of inconvenience in obtaining finance for small business people that will be simplified through crowdfunding, and also this ability to receive funds without blending personal and business assets.
I'm speaking to Camille Blackburn, who was a principal advisor to the Australian government's financial system inquiry last year. After this, more about Australia's efforts in future-proofing its financial system. Good morning. Joining me today is Camille Blackburn, Principal Advisor to the Australian Government in its financial system inquiry last year. Now, Camille, you mentioned that Malaysia beat Australia to the finish line in this respect. Are there any other things that you're looking at in this part of the world in terms of innovation that perhaps the Australian market might learn from?
Absolutely. So one of the findings and one of the recommendations from the financial system inquiry was around innovation collaboration. And that is, I suspect that is one of the reasons you have beaten us to the finishing line. When we were on the financial system inquiry, we looked to Malaysia and we looked to other Asian regions where the regulators had a market promotion element to their activities. That's something that's never been part of the regulatory environment in Australia, and was something that was called out in the recommendations that given the significance of fintech and the revolution that we will see in the provision of financial services in the next decade, it is something that possibly we need the government to be more involved in or closer to. So innovation collaboration was one of the recommendations that we needed to think about how we incorporate that into our regulatory environment, and if not incorporated into our regulatory environment, how we otherwise achieve the sorts of success that you've seen in Asia through these types of initiatives.
Right. Well, since this is such an emerging sector, Camille, what would you say are some of the areas that regulators need to watch out for?
I find it fascinating. I mean, for someone like me that's in financial services and public policy, there are some real issues that are emerging that haven't been traditionally within the concerns of our securities regulators. The backbone of a lot of fintech innovation really is about data and about data mining and about making sure that decisions that are made in the provision of financial services use the best available data to inform those decisions. So peer-to-peer lending is another interesting sort of mega trend that's occurring in credit provision, in lending. And that is about people lending directly to other people. And the interesting thing about peer-to-peer lending is that it's typically, the term is used where the lender is not a bank. So you're talking about non-banks lending to people. so regulators tend to find that sort of thing quite frightening because they're not as regulated as the lenders are not as regulated as banks. Right. But the interesting thing about those people that are now holding themselves out as peer-to-peer lenders, some of them have real advantages over banks in their credit decisions.
In what way?
In that they can access the traditional way in which banks have made credit decisions is that you, as a small, medium enterprise, you go in and you talk to them and you talk to them about your aspirations for their business and you tell them about your personal finances, and it's a point-in-time discussion and they make a decision whether or not to lend to you. Mm-hmm. A lot of the emerging peer-to-peer models globally use information and different data sets to make those credit decisions. So some of those peer-to-peer lenders, for example, have access to real-time payments information. They might be a payments provider to you. So they can see that your cash flow, they can see real time what your cash flow is. Mm-hmm. And so when they're making their decisions whether to lend you money, they can see the actual cash that you're receiving day to day. So instead of receiving point-in-time information about the success of your business, they're seeing it every day.
Wow.
So it's more refined. It's more refined information about your success as a small business person, which should lead to better credit decisions.
Okay.
And they're also not burdened by big legacy systems, computer systems, and the cost overheads that some of our other institutions have. These are small, agile providers that are focused on providing real-time, low-cost services to areas where traditionally you may not have been able to obtain finance.
Right.
So over time, I think that some of these providers will in fact provide superior service than some of our incumbents, and hopefully, I mean, isn't this interesting? Hopefully those incumbents will recognise that and suck them up into their own systems, and then consumers continue to win.
Camille, I'm curious to know, with the inquiry, who is the inquiry protecting as an end user? Is it the consumer? Is it the regulator? Is it the banks? Is it the system? So when you make those regulatory decisions, who are you thinking about?
So the inquiry or the regulator?
With the inquiry, with
so
your
the inquiry
recommendations.
is a government. It's a government initiative. So the Australian government is saying we would like advice from an independent inquiry about how our financial system is going, and given what we can see about the future coming at us, mm-hmm. are we happy that it's robust and it's ready for the sorts of challenges that we can see coming our way? I mean, the interesting thing about the inquiry that we've just had is that it really came off the back of the global financial crisis. So one of the concerns of the inquiry was to look at some of the changes that occurred over the global financial crisis, both to the system itself, but also to the regulation of the system, just to check that those measures were balanced and measures that we did want embedded for going forward.
I see.
So it's a point-in-time assessment, as it has to be once you choose your 15 years. But it really is, when you say, is it for the good of, who are we worrying about? It was for the government, so the government wants some comfort about the current settings, but I think ultimately it's always about the consumer.
Right. Okay. Well, shall we walk through some of the recommendations that you made in the report that was released last year? Out of the 44 findings, the recommendations that you put forth, which personally do you feel really needs to be addressed almost immediately?
So I am strolling into a bit of shaky territory here because I worked on the report, but the report now is with the government. I'm not. Right. I don't work for the government, so I don't want to I don't want to mislead listeners into thinking that I can speak for the government. I can't do that.
Understood. But you were a principal advisor and had a lot of access to the information behind the scenes.
Yeah, which I can't talk about.
But in your experience?
Yes, but in my experience. So the bit that I was that really captured my imagination, and it's captured obviously the imagination of people here in Malaysia as well, is this future proofing for innovation. So the settings that we have in Australia are not that dissimilar to the settings that you have here in Malaysia, and they will require adjustment for a lot of these fintech innovations that we're seeing going forward. So for me, they are the issues that most economies actually need to address with some urgency, because the pace at which these changes are going to be upon us is going to increase, not decrease.
Do you look at other countries for best practices? So, for instance, in innovation, for instance, with fintech, do you look at the United States, the regulation there? Are they far ahead in terms of regulation?
Are we lucky? In that financial services is now almost unfortunately, the global financial crisis helped this. We all talk a lot more to each other about issues in our...
It's become so globalised.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we recognise the contagion effects, and we recognise that the issues we can draw on each other's experiences in our own economies. But we look at lots of different models. We're a bit odd in Australia in that we have a very concentrated banking system, and interestingly, Canada has a very similar system. So
Canada?
Yeah. So we spend a bit of time chatting to colleagues in Ontario and Canada. Okay. Yeah, so that's quite interesting. We do consider ourselves part of Asia, though. So there are elements of what's going on in Asia that we would like to contribute to and be part of. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we are, sometimes we aren't. We're a funny neighbour of... We consider ourselves part of Asia, but often Asia is spoken to excluding Australia. In the fintech area, Europe has a lot of deep policy development that we can be informed by. Right. They've spent a lot of time thinking about, particularly around data protection. So they have very comprehensive laws in Europe about personal data and handling of personal data and cross-border protections for personal data. And that is an area that I think Asia, and I include Australia as part of Asia, could be informed by. They've spent a lot of time thinking about potential harms that arise out of misuse of personal data, and that's something that economies in Asia haven't spent as much time thinking about, but need to, given where we're heading in financial services.
But one could argue also, Camille, that they spend a little too much time and are a little too involved in the regulation of data. So that could also hinder progress of sectors like fintech.
That is a very commonly held view, and I don't know where I sit in that debate, but I think it is worthwhile us understanding what they assess as being the potential harms. We can then make a decision about whether or not that's something we need to legislate or we need to be interventionist about. Mm-hmm. But the bit that I think is missing in Asia is the public policy debate about whether or not those harms are something we should be more concerned about than we are. And a lot of the language that they use and some of the issues... I mean, it's absolutely fascinating, some of the debates that are going on in Europe about data portability. Right. Where financial services organisations receive certain information from you and I about whether they will provide us services, and they decide not to provide you a service. In the UK, for example, if a bank decides not to give a small business a loan, they are required to provide you with a printout of your personal information and the facts that they considered, so you can go to the bank next door or you can go to another alternative provider and not go through the same process of providing the information all over again. You just have your data set and you hand it over, and somebody else is ready to consider it without you needing to go through all of that, that pain again. And that's about minimising switching costs between providers. So making it far more agile, responding to a little person's needs.
Well, protection from harm, as you mentioned earlier, should there be a standard globally? Is there a minimum standard, or do you think in every country they should make those decisions themselves?
Well, at the moment it is happening jurisdiction by jurisdiction. This is the challenge. So we've just come out of the GFC. We've spent a lot of time talking about systemic risks and contagion across economies. Mm-hmm. I think this is hopefully the next debate that we need to have in that forum, is that fintech is occurring globally and it involves data transfers across borders. Mm-hmm. So it would be very sensible indeed if the global financial regulators could turn their minds to principles that should apply globally in this space. And that, of course, is already happening. It's more happening on a regional level than a global level.
Right. So Asia, ASEAN, for instance, and then Europe and all that.
Yeah,
okay.
So data protection. If you think about cross-border data transfers, there are principles in ASEAN, there are principles in Europe, there are principles in the US, and they're not the same. Mm. So some standardisation, of course, these things are very difficult issues, but they are going to be upon us quite quickly. So
yeah, it's a big issue to tackle.
It is a big issue to tackle.
Well, I've been speaking to Camille Blackburn, who was a principal advisor to the Australian government's financial system inquiry in 2014. Camille, it's been such a pleasure speaking with you today.
Melissa, I've enjoyed it very much. Thank you for having me.
I'm Melissa Idris for BFM 89.9, the business station.
The BFM Breakfast Grill was brought to you by Alliance Bank. Banking made personal. A total banking relationship that rewards you.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. To find more great interviews, go to BFM.MY or find us on iTunes. BFM 89.9, the business station.